birthday still to Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. Dr. Welsing, welcome back to WOL.
Yes, Carl, I'm glad to be with you and your audience.
Always glad to have you. Dr. Welsing, earlier this week, someone asked you this question. We saw George Zimmerman being released, and some people were saying that it's a distraction, that you would say it's a distraction, and that we shouldn't be concerned with what's going on with George Zimmerman. Is it a distraction?
Well, in other words, I think it is an important observation on what is happening with George Zimmerman and how, it becomes important when he is bringing harm to a white female, but it wasn't as important as far as the legal apparatus is concerned when it came to his actually killing Trayvon Martin. And I say that fits in perfectly when one has an understanding of racism, white supremacy as a total system structure. I've said many times, and all of the time, that it is the understanding that we are in a total system structure of racism, white supremacy that has a very specific and important ultimate goal objective. You see, we want to pretend that racism is what we want it to be, as opposed to racism, white supremacy being what it actually is, and what on deep observation and analysis we can understand that it is. It's like we would prefer to believe, as Rodney King said, can't we all just get along? Now that is a nice goal, but it is not a goal that is going to come out in the presence of a powerful system of racism, white supremacy. So you have to deal with things as they are and transform the reality into a new reality if that is the goal objective. But you can't transform reality by ignoring what it is and pretending that it is something else, or pretending that it doesn't exist. And, Neely Fuller has said, if you do not understand white supremacy, racism, what it is and how it works, everything else that you think you understand will only confuse you. So this is, I looked at the recent hearing of George Zimmerman and put it in that context. Everything has to be put in the context of racism, white supremacy. I'm still remembering the caller that you told me about who said, why does Dr. Welsing have to talk about racism all the time? Because racism is reality. See, we keep complaining as black people of all the painful things that happen to us. Somebody on the previous show, I think on Al Sharpton's show, some gentleman from Canada, saying that racism, what he experiences as a black man, is causing him to hate being black. You see, my answer to him would be, if you understand racism, white supremacy, what it is and how it works, and you think that this is unjust and should not exist, then you use your life energy to help transform it. Not start hating yourself as the answer to something that is painful to you.
Well, and I bet there's a lot of Africans and African Americans who fit into that category, hate being black, but somehow it doesn't. They don't, how can I say? They don't talk about it like that. They just do certain things.
See, they want to ignore it, and they want to believe fantasy. And so then when reality hits them, then they are thrown totally off base. As opposed to, again, understanding it for exactly what it is. Racism is a behavioral system structure that people who classify themselves as white, when they discovered in the 15th century following their circumnavigations of the planet and finding out everybody on the planet were colored people other than themselves in Europe. That was the base of where white people were. But everybody else on the planet was colored. And they found out that they were a very tiny minority on the planet. The vast majority of people on the planet were humans, H-U-E, in human beings. And then they found out that the people of color were genetically dominant. And if the planet of people just mixed together and there wasn't a consideration about color, everybody would have been colored, including the albino mutations to white. If they mixed with black, the products would be people of color. Well, at some point, 500 years ago or so, people who classified themselves as white realized what the situation was, even though they didn't have genetics institutions. I mean, they knew practical genetics. When you mix this with this, it's just like an artist mixing certain pigments together. When you take white and mix it with blue, you're going to get a different color. You're not going to get white again. Anyway, that when they realized that they could be caused to disappear, which is what President Obama represents. He's the icon, if you will, the present-day icon sitting in the White House of white genetic annihilation. And he is catching absolute holy hell every day, pulling him down, demeaning him. You see, I'm sure he feels that he's hated when he puts his head down on the pillow every day if he pays attention to what's going on in the news. That represents white genetic annihilation. Now, people do not, I think that, in a way, like children, black people pretend they prefer fantasy, like children prefer to believe it's Santa Claus, that a white man comes down the chimney bringing gifts. And black people want to believe that white people are going to love them. That is what the whole religious instruction of black people for the last 500 years. That if they act right, then some white God figure is going to love them. You see, all of that was done very deliberately by people who classify themselves as white. You oppress and dominate people of color, and then you give them an image of God as the same image of the oppressor. Well, out of that, just like there was a musical, Arms Too Short to Box with God, meaning black people, you cannot overthrow the white God. And black people are psychologically in that trap to the extent that they do not fully understand racism. I gave a paper at the medical convention in Toronto, the National Medical Association's psychiatry section, in July. And my paper was the number one mental illness in this country, in the world, is the denial of racism. Because racism is the reality. People who classify themselves as white deny racism. They use the word, but they don't want it spelled out for what it is, because it is the sum total of their behavior on the planet for their genetic survival. So they don't want it talked about. They are in power, so they can control whether or not it is discussed. People who discuss it become the pariahs, and people who play that they will not discuss it, well, they can have a job, they can, have income, they can have a position, they can be on television, they can teach in a university, as long as you use the word racism, but you don't analyze it, meaning take the responsibility back to the people who classify themselves as white.
Hang on a sec, doctor. We got to take a break for traffic and weather. Once you come back, explain to us, is that what's called a white privilege? 800-450-7876, number to call. Speak to Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. You know her from the ISIS papers and also from the Cress Theory of Color Confrontation. Take your phone calls for her in about 2.5 minutes. And thank you for staying with us, folks. Of course, you can always reach us on Facebook and Twitter. You can follow us and like us as well on Facebook and Twitter at CarlNelsonShow.com. Our guest is Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. And before the break, I asked you, Dr. Welsing, is this what's known as white privilege? They, it's understood because of their complexion that there's certain things that, that they're afforded to them?
Well, Carl, I say that the phrase white privilege is a game that people who classify themselves as white play. The terminology is white supremacy. See, white privilege, if you say, look at the two phrases, white privilege, white supremacy. Privilege is a less odious concept than white supremacy, the determination to be superior over other people or to oppress other people. You see, if white supremacy has been the historic practice, why play games with using terms like whiteness or white privilege? These are terms that people who classify themselves as white have come up with to get away from the language use of a Neely Fuller who says system of racism, white supremacy, or Frances Welsing who uses the same terminology. You see, there's a Chinese proverb that says the beginning of wisdom is to use the correct words. See, it's like playing the same game. Well, instead of saying the word N-I-G-G-E-R, let's say N-word, as though the reason for the so-called N-word is the system of racism, white supremacy. It is a designation of the people who have to be demeaned and degraded for white genetic survival. You see, so people pretend, oh, well, that word is gone. It doesn't have any meaning. Oh, yes, it does. It's just like the swastika and the Confederate flag. All of those symbols have meaning of white supremacy. So we have to really ask ourselves, and the Attorney General stated it clearly in a question, are we a nation of cowards, being unable to talk about racism? He didn't say being unable to talk about white privilege or whiteness. He said being unable to talk about racism. And so then if we just look further, one of the critical things that has to be taught in a system of racism, white supremacy, a system for white genetic survival, a system to prevent white genetic annihilation, is black self-hatred. See, if you're going to oppress certainly a large number of people, a majority of people, then you have to teach them to hate themselves. Once you teach them to hate themselves, by using such words as the N-word, plus the other dynamics, because the system operates in all areas of activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war, using patterns of perception, logic, symbol formation, thought, speech, action, and emotional response. You see, the system uses all of those areas of activity to achieve its objective. And so teaching black self-hatred is critical, because once you teach people to hate themselves, they will engage in destroying themselves. They will help the dynamic of white genetic survival by destroying and killing themselves. And they will do it based on a color code If you're black, get back, brown, stick around, yellow, mellow, white, right. That's the essential color code for white genetic survival, because black has the greatest genetic potential to produce the black pigment melanin that causes skin coloration, or shall I say responsible for skin coloration. And so when one wonders why are black people at the bottom of the scale, because black people pose the greatest genetic threat. Perception of the greatest genetic threat to white genetic survival. White is a genetic deficiency state not defined by Cress Welsing. This is in the formal science of genetics. It's a mutation because of the inability to produce a necessary enzyme, tyrosinase, that leads to the production of melanin pigment. If that enzyme tyrosinase is missing, the melanocyte, the cell that produces melanin, is there, but the cell can't function because of the missing enzyme. That's called a genetic deficiency state. Now, so this is what is going on. You know, we talk about violence and why can't there be gun control and why are blacks killing blacks and black self-hatred. All of this is dynamically tied, directly, indirectly, to this dynamic of racism, which we don't have enough self-respect or courage, as the Attorney General would say, to talk about it. White people do not have the courage to talk about it. And black people know that if they talk about it, white people will be upset and not employ them, or not give them a job, or not give them a grant, or not give them a this or that or the other. And so black people don't talk about it as they watch their children being uneducated, as they watch themselves being unemployed at twice or 3 or 4 times the level of people who classify themselves as white. As we watch this disaster, as we watch gentrification and black people being forced out of the cities, not just the District of Columbia, but Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, moving black people out of the urban centers, out of the political power centers, into Bantustan's around the city. People don't even want to look at it or talk about it, but that's because, you see, every time it's like, you know, I'm like everybody else. You wake up in the morning and you turn on the television, you say to look at the news. But you were really getting your first daily indoctrination into racism, white supremacy, because the images that you see are white, 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 white. And then an occasional black, or a black person buffooning in a commercial. I think it's Geico that has a commercial with a little black kid jumping up and down like they had the little children on the plantation, the little black children doing a jig for white people's entertainment. See, we don't even understand the images from Scandal to all of the other images that are given to us. The LA preachers or the DC housewives or all of these really despicable images. We don't even have a concept of what is a constructive image of ourselves. And yet,
for a second, Doc. So why are we watching these shows in such high numbers?
I said the system, the first and foremost thing that has to be destroyed is self-respect. See, if your self-respect is destroyed, then you will be dancing and singing words like the B word. We ought to be able to say it because the B word, the N word, gangsters, thugs, dogs. This is what black people have been trained in the last decade or two to call themselves.
And the question is, who is the person responsible? Because people are going to say, well, it's us, our people using those words. Nobody taught them to say those things.
No, but if they didn't have distributors, if they didn't have people to distribute, and you can talk to the artists, and the artists will say they want to say other things, but they're told that's not what is wanted. They want trash and nasty images, but not of other people, but of black people.
Why?
I said again and again, because we are in a system for white genetic survival. The images have to either be so that people will hate themselves and destroy themselves, or so that it will make comfort for other people to destroy them. It's no different than Adolf Hitler did in Nazi Germany. Hitler said that the Semites of the Jewish religion were not white, and so therefore he was going to kill 11 million. So how did you get the population ready to do that? Well, that was the work of his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, where he was making certain that there were horrible negative images of Jews in the magazines, the newspapers, and the movies. And so the people would internalize, the German people would internalize, these people are not really human beings.
All right, hold that thought right there, Doc, because we're going to take a break at the bottom down. When you come back, I want you to tell us what happened to the Jews. Is that's what's going to happen to us? I'll let you answer that question on the other side. Folks, you too could join the conversation with Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. It's real simple. It's 800-450-7876. Or hit me up on Facebook and Twitter at CarlNelsonShow.com. Taking calls in about 2.5 minutes. Folks, of course, we're on Facebook and Twitter at CarlNelsonShow.com. You can hit us up there. Or down the conventional method, 800-450-7876. Speak to psychiatrist Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. Before the break, Dr. Welsing, you have drawn comparisons to what happened to the Jews and with Hitler, with certainly what's happening to us. Do you see that? The end result the same as well?
Well, you see, the logical extension of the fear of being able to be genetically annihilated is to cause the genetic annihilation of the people that you are afraid of. And that's genocide. And we are in a genocide period right now as black people in this area of the world. And it is happening through the destruction of black men. See, the United Nations definition of genocide begins with when the reproduction of a people is being interfered with deliberately. And so, you know, people complain about black male unemployment, young black male unemployment. And so then that leads people into using drugs out of depression and selling drugs, and guns are brought into the community. And then that becomes the reason to incarcerate them in long periods of incarceration, so that you end up with black men being warehoused. It is only males who can impose sexual intercourse for reproduction. And so women are not feared in terms of being the genetic annihilators, but men are. That's why we have, as a major part of our history, where black men were being lynched and castrated, their genitals attacked. And it was always behind a statement that they thought about having sex with a white woman, or they would say something to a white woman, even if it was 14-year-old Emmett Till. Now, many people can be blindsided. They say, well, you know, people can interracially marry. You see all these black men marrying white women. It may be more black men marrying white women than black men marrying black women now. Marrying. That may be true, but that's like a blinder. Because simultaneously, you have large numbers of black men being incarcerated. And so then you have 70+% of your families as single-parent households without males. And so then you end up with the effeminization of male children. And so all of this, if you're not able to see the whole picture and understand the whole picture, you don't understand where the small pieces that are a part of the system, when they're moved around on the board, you don't understand what they mean. And so people will look at Scandal and think, they might think, this is entertainment. This is a black lady who's in the White House. You see, other people are looking at it and saying she's no different than Sally Hemings was to Thomas Jefferson. What's new about a black woman being taken sexual advantage of? I say taken sexual advantage of because she's not the equal. People who are in unequal power positions, you see, one can call that just a glorified form of rape. She calls it a job. And we don't see it, but it's how is it being translated in the minds of people who classify themselves as white in a system structure of racism, white supremacy. You see, but going back to Hitler, it's like if you can manipulate and control the image, so you make people look. In Germany, there was a German phrase, Tiermensch, meaning animal people. That's what they called the Semites of the Jewish religion. Hitler said, I'm not concerned about their religion. I'm killing them because they're not white. Now, they may classify themselves as white here. That was not the case in Germany. Hitler said they were not white, and they, along with the other people who were classified as non-white, were going to be killed. And so they manipulated and made sure that there were negative images. And that's why Semites of the Jewish religion, you cannot do negative images of them. They have an anti-defamation league. They control their image. They control the words that are used about them. But they had to maybe go through losing a third of their world population to reach that point of understanding. We don't have any understanding of what we are dealing with. And it's very important. I say what really needs to be elevated is not only understanding of what is going on, but to understand that there has been a complete shattering of black self-respect. Shattering to the extent some young person was telling me about, rap and some of the rap songs that are saying to black men, marry anybody other than a black woman. Now, they may think that's cute. It's like Russell Simmons thinking it was funny to do some kind of video film of the image of Harriet Tubman enjoying having sex with a slave master. That's funny. You see, or people singing about, demeaning black skin color. And that's something that people sing and dance to. If I didn't force myself to be optimistic, I could become a pessimist. But I'm not going to become a pessimist.
(800-450-7876) is the number to call. Speak to Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. Let's take our calls. Let's go to line 2. OC's in Altadena, California. OC, you're on with Dr. Welsing.
Good afternoon, Dr. Welsing and Carl.
Good afternoon.
Dr. Welsing, I am enjoying the conversation that you brought to us, and I want to say that I went to see the movie 12 Years a Slave. Did you perhaps see that movie?
No, I haven't seen that.
Oh, wow. Well, then,
I know about it, but I haven't seen it.
Okay, what you're talking about when you mention about how white supremacy views black people and sex, and there was one scene, the initial scene in this movie, it stood out in my mind above all other things in the movie, and I read the book trying to find the basis for that scene in the book, but there was nothing there. In the opening scene, the main character and a female were intimate for seemingly no reason other than the fact that she was a female and he was a male. They didn't know each other, they had not seen each other, and just, I mean, to me...
Two black people or a black and a white?
Two black people, a black slave and a black female slave and a black male slave. Mm-hmm. It was just like two dogs that you would put in a room, and they're intimate. And there was, when I go to a movie, I look to see if I can see anything in the movie that will give me an indication of whether or not this role of white supremacy is going to rear its ugly head in this particular movie. And the very first scene, this is what came across to me. I try to look behind and beyond what is being shown or talked about to see if the subtlety of white supremacy racism is alive and well. And this is what I gleaned from that particular scene. And I just wanted to know if I'm the only one that noticed this or paid any attention, or am I grasping at straws, or just exactly what is going on here? Because I can't see the producer, I can't see him putting that scene in the movie. I mean, I'm still trying to figure the significance of it.
Well, let me say this. For example, we have seen movies of the Holocaust, and I'm sure that in concentration camps, the victims would be having sexual...
Because we got to take another break, and I want you to get into it. I'll see you stay with us as well. Okay. Folks, you can join the conversation with Dr. Francis Cress Welsing at 800-450-7876, and caller was OC from Altadena. I'm going to let Dr. Welsing respond to OC's question.
Well, I was going to say that, you know, with pictures that you've seen of the Holocaust, you've probably never seen people having a sexual relationship, because when people's self-respect level is high, they protect the image of sexual intercourse and how that is being portrayed. You see, but the demeaning of African people in the formal enslavement process was breeding people, treating them like animals, and demeaning them. Now, one of the things that I have felt about these slave films that are coming out, instead of black people understanding that slavery was simply one phase of the racism, white supremacy dynamic, racism, white supremacy is continuous. But if they can deflect black people, don't think about racism in the present. Just look at these horror pictures of racism in the past, and we will pretend that was going on during slavery. But we don't have anything similar going on, or do you see anything that would be the same going on today? But in reality, we have black men and women having sexual relations and not being able to take care of their children, and the children being given up to foster care and passed from one house to another house, which is no different than doing formal slavery.
Well, Dr. Welsing, in this particular scene, I spoke to a commentator about this particular scene, and he almost negated it by saying that, well, they were in this crowded room and this is what slaves did and all. But if this whole idea that this man had been so brutally beaten, and this female, she was chained, and they did this in chain. I mean, the whole idea, it's just in my mind, it's mind-boggling to think that these two people would think about this particular act in this crowded room where there were other slaves and they were all chained together, this said volumes to me about what we are thought of as people, to think that this is where our minds are in a given situation like this. I mean, it was so it's mind-boggling to me. I'm still trying to fathom it.
I would just really say to you, please try to understand racism as a total system structure that has as its ultimate goal objective white genetic survival. And so therefore, certain things have to be done with the image of black people. Now, to the extent that black people don't understand racism and want to ignore it and want to pretend that it doesn't exist and to say as long as I'm making money, it doesn't mean anything. Image doesn't mean anything. This is just entertainment. This doesn't have any meaning. They just don't have any kind of in-depth understanding as to how a system works. That's like, you see, you can have black and white children go to that causes black people to be injurious to one another and to not look deeply at understanding what actually is taking place in the total system. And I'm not talking about spend one iota of time or energy hating white people. That's not the answer.
I'm not anti-white, I'm pro-black.
Well, it's like, fine, you can be pro-black, but it's like just being pro-black and not understanding what the game is, the intricacies of the system and how it works. See, a person can be pro-football and not understand the nuances of the game, so they're just standing on the side being pro-football.
True.
Where there are people who make it a science to understand the game and how it's played.
Well, I thank you for your explanation. Now, I don't know if anybody else was hit by this like I was hit, but it just said loud and clear to me, white supremacy rears its ugly head. And I thank you for taking my call, and I appreciate talking to you, Dr. Welsing.
Thank you for your call.
Thanks, LC. Let's keep moving. Let's go to line 3. Robert's in Kansas City. Robert, you know we talked to Francis Cress Welsing. Shall we go? Let's go to line 4 then. William in D.C.
Hi, I'm just listening to the conversation, and you know, when you talked about the statement that Eric Holder made about this is a nation of cowards, that's what prompted me to call. You know, I'm a taxi driver in the District of Columbia, and I'm an African-American male, and 85 to 90% of my passengers are white. And the statement that Eric Holder made, coupled with the Trayvon Martin killing, has prompted me to engage my white passengers in dialogue about racism. And, you know, what I told a lady yesterday, because they are more open to discuss it than I thought they would be. It's normally the white male who views me who's really not open for discussion. But the white female, a lot of times, she can really identify with it because she's been subjugated by the same white male. She's been subjugated as well. And so I was telling the white lady in my cab that if I was an armed robber and what I did for a living was rob people, and I was in my leisure and I was not robbing somebody, that I had my gun showing by accident, or somebody brought to my attention, hey man, you got a gun hanging out, I would kind of shush them and I wouldn't want to discuss the fact that I have a gun. And that's why this country does not want to talk about racism. It's because they got a gun. It's like they got their foot on black people's necks, and that enables them to stand just a little taller than they normally would stand. And so, of course, they don't want to discuss it. that I kind of
Let's give her a chance to respond to that. Thanks.
No, well, I understand what the gentleman is saying. It's like if, people who classify themselves as white male and female are responsible for racism, white supremacy. You see, one can always raise the question, are you white? And the person says yes, and you say, well, what's the importance of being white? You see, now, if they answer, well, they might say, if they're honest, there's power and privilege that goes with being white. And so I hang on to, I don't call myself a Euro-American. I say I'm white. Because that's what the system is about. Do you see what I'm saying? So I'm just saying male and female are responsible. But if it comes to who would be the responsible people to defend the system of white supremacy, you might say, well, it'll be all the people who classify themselves as white, but it'll be mostly males. So the males are certainly aware. And you don't have white females walking around talking about in the system of racism, white supremacy. They can be maybe at some level, sometimes, occasionally, more sympathetic. But they're not talking about giving up the system. And so this gentleman is just bringing out that it's hard for a black man to engage in talking about racism, white supremacy with a white male than with a white female. Do you see? But I would just say, be cautious, because she might say, he was offending me, trying to get me to talk about racism, and called the police on her cell phone. To call it an assault. He made me afraid of him.
Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Welsing. In their culture, is there a hierarchy? Is some whites better than none? We have that color scale that we have from crystal black to almost white. Do they have something similar in the white subculture?
Right. I remember years ago talking to
I tell you what, hold that thought, because we got to take a break and we're at the top of the hour, and I'll let you respond on the other side. Also take your phone calls, West and Ron as well. You two can join the conversation with Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. It's real easy. 800-450. See the same with us, folks. Of course, you can reach us on Facebook and Twitter. You can follow us and like us over there as well. Or you can use the conventional method, 800-450-7876. Our guest is Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. You know her. You should have her book, The ISIS Papers, Press Color Competition. She had that book as well. But before the break, I was asking, because Doc Wilson always tells us about how it is that you're black, stick back, you're brown, stick around, and you're yellow, you're male, whatever. We have that sequence of color scheme. I just wonder if they have that in the white community too as well. Dr. Welsing?
See, that color scheme, Carl, that goes on, that black people know about, black people didn't develop that. That was taught to us by white supremacy. In other words, the more pigment you have that can cause my genetic annihilation, you have to go to the back of the line. The lesser the level of pigment that you have, I will be less afraid of you calling my white genetic annihilation, but you can still cause it in time. And so that is an imposition from the system of white supremacy itself. Now, you asked me whether whites have that kind of color code for themselves. I was told by a Scandinavian teacher, a woman from Scandinavia teaching in D.C. public schools some time ago. And she said in Scandinavia, we don't consider the Italian or the Jewish people to be white. You see, I mean, as you move from Northern Europe to Southern Europe, you're moving increasingly in Southern Europe, because you had black people in Europe, the Moors invading Africa, invading Europe, and they were in Spain for 700 years. And so that left dark complexions in Italy and in Spain. You had Hannibal in Rome and all of those people of color. So you had racial mixing. And after the Moors were pushed out of Spain, that's when bullfighting began. And so the significance of pushing the black people out is memorialized in the symbolism of the bullfight. You see, and so then you have people dressed in white running from these black bulls through the street, and then they go into the bull ring, and the man in his suit of lights, the matador, ends up stabbing and killing the black bull, which is the same symbolism as killing and lynching and castrating a black man. You see, because the Moors had invaded Spain, and when they left, everybody was darker. So that's why you have the lightest white people are in Northern Europe and coming down, you see, through France and Spain and Portugal. You have darker people. Well, that is the genetic material from the black people on the southern side of the Mediterranean.
800-450-7876 to speak to Dr. Welsing. Try line 2. West is in Atlanta, Georgia. West, you're on with Dr. Francis Cress Welsing.
Hey, good evening, Dr. Francis. It's an honor and a pleasure to speak to you. Ms. Francis, are you aware that they're doing some more diabolical mind control on people with this electronic low frequency, i.e., my brother Aaron Alexis, they shot up the Navy Yard, and my sister Marion Carey, they was on the electronic low frequency waves, because Dr. Brown, you know about that car, know about too, and I can see you some information on it. This stuff diabolical.
Well, I personally, I've heard people discuss that, but I'm not any expert on that. But in other words, if somebody would say, to what extent would people who classify themselves as white go, based on their history, to maintain white supremacy, translate, to ensure white genetic survival, and to prevent white genetic annihilation? I would have to say any means necessary.
Yes, ma'am.
Any means necessary. But I think this, and this is why I emphasize the factor of black self-respect. Because people who classify themselves as white are a tiny minority on the entire planet. They're fewer than 1/10 of the people. And so a person could say, well, how is it that 1/10 of the people can control the 9/10? And I simply say it could be, as people who classify themselves as white through history have said, that they are genetically superior in terms of intelligence. So that's a possibility. I don't believe that is correct. The other possibility is that if they are able to program and brainwash the 9/10 people of color to hate themselves and want to be white, so the 9/10 majority becomes a functional 1/10, and the 1/10 minority becomes the 9/10 in terms of power. Because if you can control the non-white people hating themselves, and you can just measure, do non-white people hate themselves? Yes. If Francis Welsing invented 3 pills and went on eBay, the first pill would turn you white by tomorrow morning, the next pill would give you long straight hair, and the next pill would give you so-called white features, I would be the richest person in the world by the weekend, because of the level of taught self-hatred that is experienced by people of color. So you see Asians, and they want to have blonde hair, they want to cut their eyes, the people in India want to bleach their skin, the people in China and the other Asian countries want to bleach their skin, the people in Africa want to bleach their skin and have blonde wigs on, because everybody has been taught to self-hate. So you have a numerical majority, but it is weakened because of the factor of self-hate. So I say racism, white supremacy plus black self-hatred equals black genocide. You see, but that can be changed, not by begging. In other words, if the people who classify themselves as white, if they figured out, well, this is what we need to do to genetically survive, it may not be just, but to anticipate that they're going to give up their system, to me doesn't make sense. But what can take place is the people who are complaining about the injustice of racism, white supremacy. They're the ones who are victimized. They're the ones who are hurt. So if we decide that we are going to stop hating ourselves and valuing and loving ourselves and knowing that we're the mothers and fathers of everybody on this planet, including white people, black people, crystal black people are the only people that can make all of the colors, including representation to white. But if we hate ourselves and then we're begging somebody else to love us, this is sick. This is sick. Do you see? But we have to embrace ourselves and understand, wow, we're sick. And we're going to have to change it. We need to be in a posture where we say most black is most beautiful. Why? Because it produces all the colors. It's the mother color. Most black is most beautiful, and we probably end up finding that it's most powerful. I mean, just like the white people go into space and they say, you know, the most powerful thing in space is a black hole or dark matter. Do you see? But the dark people on the planet have been taught to hate themselves. We have to reverse that. All the colors are okay, but we have been in the psychological training of white supremacy and self-hatred. And so there's a lot of very destructive behavior that goes on under the pressure of racism, white supremacy, that black people could decide that they're going to take hold of. And I think that, you know, people wonder, well, what can we do? Neely Fuller, in his work, in his textbook for victims of racism, laid out some very basic, kindergarten, simple behavior that if black people would just reflect on that. And
I go right there, Doctor. We're going to take another break. I'll let you finish up on Neely Fuller. Wes, thanks for your call. Folks, we're going to hold 800-450-7876. Speak to Dr. Welsing.
White supremacy. And I add to that list, stop using and selling drugs to one another. Stop black children from thinking that as children they can be adequate mothers and fathers. Stop throwing down trash where black people live, work, and play. Stop making dirt and filth the norm. Stop pretending that racism, white supremacy does not exist. Stop allowing racism, white supremacy programming black, brown, red, and yellow people to fight and squabble with each other. Now see, these are behaviors. All these behaviors are things that the individual person has the power to control. They can exercise that power. And I believe that self-respect is more powerful than a nuclear weapon. And if black people decide that this is what we're going to be about, our agenda. See, I'm not talking about these things, talk about hating white people, that's cheap. But to replace a system of injustice, which is racism, white supremacy, to replace it with a system of justice. And justice means no one is mistreated. No one is allowed to be mistreated. And those who need the most help get the most help. But that cannot happen in a system of racism, white supremacy, because that necessitates violence, it necessitates killing, it necessitates poverty. So when you look around the world and you see all these people with skin pigmentation living in mud and dirt and uneducated, no health care, then white can feel superior. Even though white goes around and some movie star will grab a group of little black children and put some food in their mouths. That's not solving the problem of white supremacy. That necessitates looking at inferiorized people of color. Looking at the Haitians, looking at the Africans. So no, we want to talk about racism, white supremacy, and have clarity of understanding what it is that we are dealing with, and to have the courage to look at it and the self-respect to do behavior modification. You see, and undoing this critical damage of damaging self-respect, so that people don't know, when I play this role in a movie, what am I doing to the image of black people, myself, in the system of racism, white supremacy? None of these films, none of these plays are in the abstract. What am I doing? See, I say that most of the leaders in the civil rights movement, many of them have been ministers. And so then they come out with LA ministers and making a buffoon image of black ministers. That falls on Al Sharpton. But we don't understand it because we don't know how to look at things as a whole. It's sort of like looking at a puzzle and see where the different pieces fit. We just think we're looking at an individual piece and then go off in a corner and complain. No, we are going to have to be able to see the problem as a whole and understand what role can each individual person play. No time to hate white people, be discourteous to white people, be disrespectful. No, it's no time for that. It's time for self-respect and engaging in behavior that reflects we do respect ourselves. I say the high point in the last 500 years for black people was the civil rights era, when those black people decided that they were going to break the back of segregation. And so Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, all the SNCC people, all the civil rights people who went up against horses and dogs and fire hoses and broke the back of segregation at that period. And out of that, giving their lives, putting their bodies on the line. And if you look at the way the people were dressed, there were no men in that movement who had their pants hanging down. They were in suits, they were in shirts, they were in ties, they were in hats. They were walking in black dignity and black self-respect and black pride, just like the women were. And they broke the back of that phase of white supremacy. And I say the powers that be said, wait a minute, this is dangerous. Look at what these people have done. No other group in America had done that. And out of that, people came talking about black is beautiful, black pride, black dignity, black self-respect, black power. And the system of white supremacy said to itself, we can't have this. We have to turn this around. How will we do it? And so they thought and they thought and they said, oh, what we'll do is tell them they can be movie stars. And what we will do is have them demean and degrade themselves. But they will think that they're just being actors and actresses. But they will be using drugs. And they will be cursing and demeaning each other. The men will be demeaning the women and kicking them and beating them. And the women would be acting trashy. But we will tell them that they're movie stars. And we will pay them thousands of dollars and millions of dollars. And we will praise them and give them Oscars. And tell them, oh, they are so wonderful, but they will have degraded themselves. And through the movies, mass educated their population to demean and degrade itself. Coming up to the present.
Hang on a second, Doctor. We're going to take a break. Dr. Welsing?
Well, my only comment is that I do think this, as long as we fail collectively to address the problem of racism, we're all just going to see the symptoms of the problem that are everywhere. Do you see, we have to act as though we understand what is at cause and not just talk about it on the parking lot, but to talk about it openly, because it is wounding and injuring us. I started saying that whether the person is black or whether the person is white, if they refuse to talk about racism, white supremacy, they are acting as though they hate black people. The reason that I'm saying that is because racism is a fear in the heart of black people, and it's killing black people. And so it would be like, if I invited you, Carl, let's say I invited you to my home, and I had some food on the table, and there was one or two pieces that there was poison in, and I said, have some food, and I didn't tell you that this one and the next one have poison in it, and so then you picked that. Wouldn't you have the right to say, Dr. Welsing must hate me?
Yeah.
You see, because she led me into something and she wouldn't tell me the truth. And so, as a result of that, I was severely injured. I might be dead, God forbid. You see what I'm saying? So this is a thing that is harming us. It didn't start harming us on the 13th of September. This has been harming us for 500 years. And I was listening today to WPFW, and they had in their archives, tapes. You can send a contribution and you can get archives of a whole lot of different speeches. And they happen to have had, one of the speeches was Dr. Martin Luther King's speech at the Riverside Church. And Dr. Martin Luther King was talking about the evil of racism, and talking about racism had to be confronted. And when I think about how black people are led into focusing on Dr. Martin Luther King's work as a dream, and he specifically in the Riverside speech talked about the serious problem of racism. Everybody in the listening audience ought to go out and try to get copies of Dr. Martin Luther King's speech at the Riverside Church in New York and listen to what he said, and then say, well, why is the emphasis put on dreaming as opposed to the specific thing that he was focusing on that ended up killing him? Was racism. Racism is white supremacy. That's the only racism. So you know, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, everybody, we have got to find what Eric Holder was talking about, the courage. And courage doesn't come forward in the absence of self-respect. And we have to get the self-respect. We have to do the exercises that help build the muscle of self-respect. Not name-calling, not gossiping, not squabbling with one another, and not being discourteous and disrespectful to one another, and stealing from one another, and robbing one another, and fighting one another, and killing one another. See, and the other thing, when we talk about the violence and young people engaging in violence, all these young black men that may be harming each other and harming themselves are victims of the violence and the terrorism of racism and white supremacy. And it's unemployment, where young black men don't see there's no place for me to be somebody. And so when they see that, well, what's the point in struggling in school if all the men are standing on the corner with no jobs, and then selling drugs and going to jail and sitting in jail, and never no opportunity to functionally be a husband and functionally be a father. So there's some deep thinking that we need to be engaged in. I mean, people ought to make that, you know, their so-called holiday activity, to do some deep thinking. And let black self-respect be the centerpiece at Thanksgiving and at Christmas.